Welcome everybody to our session. This is a parallel session on pandemics and the politics of knowledge. My name is Hayley MacGregor and I'm going to chair the session. I'm a medical anthropologist at the Institute of Development Studies. So I'm just going to start by laying out the structure of our session. So I'll give a brief introduction to the focus, and then I'll introduce each of our three panelists in turn, and they'll make their interventions followed by some overarching remarks from our discussant, Melissa Leach. And then I'm hoping we still have a final 15 minutes where we'll invite comments and questions from the rest of you as the audience. And then hopefully a bit of time to finally return to the panelists for some responses to questions. So I'd appreciate if as the audience you could keep yourselves muted during this first session until I invite you to comment when you're welcome to unmute and speak your questions. Please do note that the session is being recorded and our panelists have agreed to that, but this does mean that they might refrain from commenting on certain sensitive issues. So first of all, just a brief introduction to the session. So we're going to discuss the politics of policy advice with a particular focus on the challenges associated with engaging as social scientists with policymakers as part of advisory committees during COVID-19. And as I'm sure you're aware, the pandemic has really catalyzed interest in this space and renewed interest really in this whole interface between science and public policy, and the political dynamics that characterize spaces for advice and decision making have really played out amidst this combination of the urgency of crisis, ongoing uncertainties, a deepening of inequalities, and also ideological divides, as we'll hear. And the balance of disciplinary expertise requested on these advisory committees in most contexts has tended to the side of epidemiology and clinical science disciplines, but there has actually been a sort of involvement increasingly actually of social and behavioral scientists. And we've also found ourselves on national scientific advisory groups or in advisory roles, for example, for UN agencies. And we thus decided it would be interesting to use this pandemic session to actually invite reflections from a panel, but also you as the wider audience, on how the politics of knowledge has manifested in these advisory engagements. And we particularly want to surface questions about issues such as hierarchies of evidence and whose knowledge has been heard in these spaces, as well as more broadly the ways in which power and politics might shape knowledge production, the framing of problems, the prioritization of evidence, and indeed actual decision making. And our three panelists today are all social scientists who are well qualified to reflect on these issues in different national contexts. Grace Akello will speak from her experience of being invited to join a social science group in the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences, constituted quite late in the course of the pandemic, seemingly at the request of donor partners. Gustavo speaks from a context where the national Bolsonaro government in Brazil has not sought advice at all from social scientists, necessitating alternative mobilization to respond to the social impacts of COVID-19. And Melissa Parker was asked to participate in the UK Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies and subsequently also Independent SAGE, a body formed to facilitate discussion also of alternative policy responses to those adopted by government. And as you can hear, our panelists are speaking from three countries with what I would call right-wing governments, political contexts that have shaped state responses to COVID in very particular ways. And these contexts have also affected how the state has sought to then engage with social scientists or not during the pandemic. And the common themes for our focus include the challenges of navigating the low status given to qualitative evidence on committees, the challenges of navigating preconceived understandings of what social scientists can offer, and finally, also how to deal with a lack of interest from government in either acting on advice from social scientists or no interest at all in engaging, particularly if their advice is not politically palatable. So in each case, we will hear from the challenges raise questions about how to navigate different and difficult political contexts and how to engage with state initiatives, but also other structures. And our panelists will also reflect on alternative avenues for contributing to responses for COVID-19. So let us now turn to our first panelist, who I'm now going to introduce. And it's with pleasure that I introduce Grace Akello, who's a medical anthropologist at Gulu University in Uganda. And she's been a member of the Uganda National Academy of Sciences, participating in a committee on pandemic preparedness. Over to you, Grace.
Thank you, Hayley, for inviting me, and thank you, our listeners. I will try to discuss my story in a few minutes, and then I leave the time for our questions. About half a year into the pandemic, I was invited to join a multidisciplinary committee on pandemic preparedness. And this is by the Uganda National Academy of Sciences. I was quite fascinated by this invite, and I saw the work schedule already stated for us and a protocol attached. And in the inaugural meeting, I asked one question. So we have been 6 months into the pandemic. What is this committee really supposed to do in preparing policymakers for pandemic preparedness? And we were told, even though we cannot make any impact during this current pandemic, we still expect many pandemics in the future. And therefore, our discussions, which are calibrated into three meetings in a year, will be relevant to prepare or to share evidence which policymakers need, and the policymakers will design policies which will be important for the state, and the state will use such policies for future and prepare for any other threats. Since the invite, we have had 4 meetings, and I will tell you that it is quite confusing, as I always discuss with Hayley. We are invited for a meeting with an agenda already pre-set for us. And we are asked to discuss cultural issues as social scientists, behavior-related issues, since pandemics are related to behavior or lack of behavior, which enables people to adhere to standard operating procedures. For instance, washing hands, and the people are quite rebellious. They don't want to do social distance when there are barriers or parties. They sit together. Some people have been arrested when they are in a gathering which is not approved by the state. So out of these experiences, I have instead drawn some conclusions. I have asked myself, for instance, are social scientists evidence necessary for pandemic preparedness? And if such evidence is necessary, why, for instance, have we been invited 6 months down the road to help social policymakers to prepare or to design policies which will enable the state to prepare for eventualities and for pandemics? And you must note that Uganda already has frameworks. Pandemics are relegated to humanitarian frameworks, whereby if there's a health threat, the government will declare a state of emergency, and they will announce that now we are unable to deal with these threats. And therefore, humanitarians will be invited to attend to the pandemic. Unfortunately, during COVID, the humanitarians were repatriated. The humanitarians left, or they were unemployed because the offices were closed. So the state was, in effect, handling this state of emergency without referring to the usual framework. 6 months into the pandemic, there are, of course, more questions that need answering than attending to what are the social aspects, what are the cultural aspects in the communities. But I have to tell you that in all the meetings that we have attended as a committee, we have been guided to talk about cultural aspects in the communities and what are behavior-related aspects to, for instance, lack of adherence to the standard operating procedures, and what are the behavior-related aspects to rejection of vaccines, and inquiring whether people should take vaccines when they are remaining with 1 week to expire. And so I have, over the years or over the months, learned that it is difficult to engage within this framework, whereby you're given questions to answer. So if you are asked to state, in fact, briefly state the cultural aspects that you have seen in the communities, you are unable to discuss broader issues, which, for instance, affect the communities more than just their culture. For instance, to adhere to SOPs require people to have more than culture. It requires people to have the resources. It requires people who, for instance, live on everyday earnings to go and work, and you have stopped them to work. And to address a pandemic or to intervene to contain a pandemic requires one to go beyond cultural issues. And this we have not been allowed to. We have been guided, and we have been continuously advised to seek for data which show that it is people's culture, in fact, which is affecting pandemic's containment. In this regard, I do not give up hope. I know that there are other avenues that we can contact or talk to policymakers. And in this, I want to mention a new innovation that we have, the social science action plate, for humanitarian action platform. And this is going to give us an avenue, I must say, even to discuss with the politicians and scientists in the Uganda National Academy of Sciences. In this regard, I want to thank you, Hayley, for giving me this chance.
Perfect, and ending on the sort of positive note of the new initiative around a platform and slightly more independent engagement in Uganda. So our next speaker is going to take us to another continent, to Brazil. Gustavo Mata is a social psychologist at Fiocruz, which is a national public health body in Brazil, and he coordinated the Zika social science network, and is also involved in the COVID-19 Observatory on Social Impact. Gustavo, over to you.
Thank you, Hayley. Thank you for inviting me and to join unfortunately, the end of the STEP Center. So, but I heard that it will have a great experience, and I really would like to learn from you about this experience. So very quickly, because we only have a few minutes to explore a very complex topic that we were talking about politics of knowledge. We could focus on many dimensions, not only national, but also the boundaries and relations between local, national, and international scenarios. But at this time, I would like to talk a little bit about the political context and how it is influencing the pandemic responses, especially on social science and social repercussions in Brazil, right? So I have a presentation, but I'm not share this presentation because we don't have much time. Just to remember that we are suffering a second international epidemic in Brazil, because 5-6 years ago, we had Zika outbreak with a lot of impact and global and national mobilization, but in a very different scenario of our federal coordination. In that time, we have a very good support and technical support to develop many works to respond to Zika outbreak, and especially social and gender repercussions in Brazil involving sexual and reproductive rights and disabled children and many other aspects and needs. But just to highlight some quotes, recent quotes of our federal authorities. So as I am part of the Ministry of Health, because Fiocruz is an institution in Ministry of Health, the major Latin American public health institution, but we also relate with the federal government. So this tension is very sensitive, how to act, how to communicate, how to dialogue with federal authorities at the moment. But I would like to share with you some quotes from federal authorities recently. One of them was yesterday. Anvisa is our independent surveillance agency in Brazil, is recommending to have the vaccine passport to enter in Brazil, right? So as many countries are doing right now. But the president says yesterday, Anvisa wants to close the country's airspace now. Not again, damn it. So this is in public. Brazil would not discriminate against people who are not vaccinated by adopting the passport. Better to lose life than freedom. Yesterday. Well, those vaccinated against COVID-19 are developing acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, HIV/AIDS, right? In September 2021. One day they will prove that the masks don't work to protect against COVID-19, also in April of this year. So this is some of many quotes that I could select it to give you an idea what we are facing right now. It's a kind more than a negationism. This is not only in Brazil. We know that we have it during Trump governance in the US and also in the beginning of the pandemic in the UK with Boris Johnson and also in Mexico. But this conservatory wave can be very difficult to do, especially with political and social issues. So, well, there are a lot of political uncertainties that were natural during the pandemic became political threats. Brazil has been suffering an economic and political crisis since 2013. After 2016, there is an ideological polarization between conservatives and democrats. Economic austerities have cut 75% of the budget for social and science and technology programs in Brazil. The politicization of COVID-19 pandemic debate also includes negationism and unscience and anti-vaccine movements. The lack of federal government with dialogue and cooperation among states, municipalities, and society was crucial to obstruct a better response and save lives. The false dilemma between economic and health added to precedent issues have created a scenario of political fragmentation and misinformation. The political determinants or determination of health and death produced more than 600,000 deaths in Brazil. It's too much, and we could respond better because we have a very structured national health system and very good science institutions in Brazil. So there are many repercussions involved with the intersectionality and inequalities. I want just to highlight two focus: the political and social division of prevention and diagnosis. It's also involved specifically indigenous people in the indigenous lands and territory in conflicts of agribusiness in Brazil. There are many political issues and many other things involved with this. And also people who live in favela because they have to organize themselves and try to protect themselves in a kind of self-determination of the initiatives to prevent and to defend people in favelas and poor areas, especially in relation with municipalities and the territories of vulnerabilities. So the improvement of humanitarian crisis, impoverishment, the most vulnerable, psychosocial impacts, and employment, and discontinuated in insufficient emergency aids from federal and state governments. So what we call now the politics of pandemic, right? I know that it is more than it. In spite of the creation of COVID Fiocruz Observatory that we are involved in, I am responsible for social repercussions and other initiatives all over the country. Scientific institutions and social science were excluded from the federal government. So in technical committee and the national committee to respond to COVID-19 all over the country. Fiocruz and other institutions are working with states, municipalities, social movements to overcome the lack of federal government information and communication. There's a lot of lack of information, and we have to structure the information based into territories, social movements, municipalities, and also states. The democratic threats represented by authoritarianism and absence of social participation improved the response of social movements and representative of society to defend their rights and improve social activities, especially in the social networks. The digital environment, the internet was so important during especially the social distance measures all over the country. So I would like to highlight these questions and then we can go to discussions after it. I'm sorry, it was very
wonderful. Thank you, Gustavo. And I know it's been very difficult in Brazil, so I appreciate you pointing to those really hopeful elements around mobilization. We have Melissa Parker, who we briefly lost. So my comment in the chat was my relief that she managed to get back into the room. So our third panelist is Melissa Parker, who's a medical anthropologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the UK. And she's a participant in 2 subcommittees of the UK Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, as well as a member of Independent SAGE. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me. So in November 2020, I was invited to be a participant on SPI-B, the Scientific Pandemic Insights Group on Behaviour. And I subsequently contributed to the work of the ethnicity subgroup. Both groups report to UK SAGE, the UK Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. In June 2021, I began contributing to Independent SAGE, and this mainly involves working with the Behavioural Advisory Group. Discussions in the media and even some mainstream medical journals misleadingly suggest that these groups are in opposition to each other, with a BMJ article recently describing Independent SAGE as a group of rebel scientists. I do not see it this way. SPI-B and the ethnicity subgroups, in common with other subgroups, work in similar ways. Usually a question is sent from the Cabinet Office and then colleagues on the subgroup are asked to write a response based on the available evidence under the guidance of a nominated chair. The timeframe is short, often no more than a few weeks, but it can be longer. Civil servants are directly involved in the production of reports. They work closely with the chair and members of the subgroup to help source evidence, and among other things, give useful advice about how to frame the response. Independent SAGE, or Indie SAGE as it is widely referred to, is very different. It was established in May 2020 by Sir David King, a former chief scientific advisor to the government. It involves a fairly stable group of around 22 UK scientists, social scientists and professionals, including a socio-behavioural subgroup of which I am a member. One of the primary goals of Indie SAGE is to engage with diverse kinds of evidence in a rigorous and thoughtful way, and to communicate scientific and social scientific findings about COVID-19 to the public. This partly happens through written reports, but also through live briefings. Since June 2020, weekly briefings have been streamed live via YouTube with up to 20,000 viewers. They usually involve discussions of the latest data about the course of the pandemic in the UK, followed by a presentation from a member of IndieSage or a guest with relevant expertise on a particular topic. Diverse issues are discussed, including vaccine safety, new variants, vaccine equity, long COVID, ventilation, and much else besides. At times, colleagues on IndieSage have posed critical questions about the evidence informing UK COVID policies. But this is not always the case. There are numerous examples where they've supported official UK policy too, not least the decision to lengthen the gap between first and second vaccinations in January 2021. There are other times when they've expressed concern about aspects of government policy, but these concerns have almost always been endorsed by other government committees. Serious concern was expressed by IndieSage colleagues about the test and trace system, for example, and these concerns were subsequently shared by the Public Accounts Committee. Of course, both IndieSage and the government's advisory groups are working in a context where COVID-19 is highly politicized and misinformation circulates freely. Over the last 20 months or so, we've become familiar with with a sort of rather false dichotomy being enacted between politics and evidence, often for politically strategic reasons. You only have to spend a few minutes on the IDS STEPS website to realize the multiple ways in which politics actually shapes the production and interpretation of evidence. Nevertheless, there is much that can be done in this complicated space. And in my view, there is merit in holding on to the aspiration that evidence can and should be interrogated rigorously and debated both within government advisory groups and beyond. In the SAGE subgroups, it's possible to create a space to think through issues such as caring for the dying, the social life of bubbles and the rule of six, and much else besides. It's also possible to foreground approaches and issues that might otherwise be overlooked. Of course, SAGE advisors have not been elected, and they do not have a mandate to set the questions or write and operationalize the policies. Nevertheless, many of these subgroups have had helpful impacts on policy. IndieSage's impacts are different. By encouraging critical debate in public fora, it's been possible to push back at the devaluation of experts, while publicly demonstrating the multiple ways in which different kinds of expertise can be mobilized to prepare and respond to this pandemic and others which might follow in its wake. And this ultimately, I think, will be the legacy of IndieSage. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, and for sort of taking us to the heart of the politics of knowledge production. And I want to thank all my panelists for really wonderful reflections. And I'm now going to turn to Melissa Leach, and we're delighted she's agreed to be our discussant. She's a medical anthropologist who has a long-standing experience on epidemics and pandemic preparedness. And as you heard earlier, she's also director of IDS. Yeah. Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all for a wonderful set of presentations. So given that this is a STEPS conference, I wanted just to highlight that actually concern with epidemics and the politics of knowledge goes back to the very beginning of the STEPS Centre, when in 2006, colleagues and I had the privilege of helping to lead a programme which looks at a lot of different diseases and produced
I think we might just have lost Melissa briefly.
Competing potential.
Melissa, I'm so sorry, we lost you for 2 minutes. Could you just go back? You were saying,
okay,
use the book. I'm so sorry, you froze.
Okay, so sorry, bad connection here. One of the very earliest STEPS projects, which resulted in a book that I co-edited with Sarah Dry called Epidemics, Science, Politics and Social Justice, argued that all epidemics are always political, and there are always diverse and contested possible pathways of disease and response. They're always underpinned by narratives and by a politics of knowledge in which some evidence is selected and some is not. And crucially, narratives are not created equal, and they act in the world in ways that shape the course of a disease, the response to it, and crucially, who gains and who loses. And I think COVID has become a poster child for this kind of effect. And what we're seeing and what you've all just communicated is some very powerful ways in which particular pathways of understanding COVID and responding to it in these different countries are having very unequal effects on people, not just in terms of health inequalities and experiences of COVID itself, but in terms of livelihoods, in terms of people's positions in society, in terms of those wider contexts. And this is what I think social scientists could and should be doing, going way beyond the somewhat limited roles that have been cast for social scientists in all the cases you've just explored and the stories you've told so very, very convincingly. So some of the things social science could and should be doing, and I think people try to enable it to do, often beyond the formal, as we've heard, is helping to set the questions that policy should be addressing, not just responding to preset questions, helping to untangle and elucidate these pathways through which diseases transmit, people respond, technologies work, always in a social way. These things are not just medical, they are always and thoroughly social. Fine-tuning and adapting the models, putting different narratives and perspectives on the table, attending to wider contexts, as you've shown, livelihoods, political economy, and drawing attention to those marginalized, unequal, suppressed narratives that actually are really important for the perspectives and the justice of certain groups, and often for dealing effectively with a pandemic in its broader sense, much more broadly. Now, I think your stories have given us some rather depressing, but also with some elements of optimism, stories about how social science is not being currently treated in that way. We've seen being brought in late, expected to respond to preset questions, being used rather instrumentally, as Grace so beautifully put it, to provide the cultural factors to support preset political agendas, and to follow established hierarchies and established bureaucratic procedures. And sometimes, therefore, to end up being called on to support quite dangerously narrow or indeed unjust pathways of response, which I think we've seen happening in different ways in Brazil, in Uganda, and in parts of the UK. So what should we do? I think moving ahead, we need both to continue to push for the value of social science, both from the inside, from the outside, as Gustavo showed us, and in these intermediate spaces, the inside-outside, which is where the kind of chat platform that Grace mentioned might sit. But we also need to be brave, actually, about challenging and to use that understanding that has come from some parts of social science about evidence always being political, to begin to challenge some of these dominant discourses about the way that evidence is being used. So let's take the tools from research for development, the anthropology of science, and the political economy of knowledge, and try and take those as well into these fora that we're sometimes given a chance to speak in, and push to open up as well as to not allow these spaces to close down these important voices. This is going to be vital, not just for the rest of COVID, for it isn't over yet, but also in resetting preparedness for future pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and very much appreciate that, while broadening back out to the big steps themes that we've always pursued in the pandemic's work at IDS and with our partner institutions. I'm hoping we're going to be given at least another 5 minutes to hear from you as the audience. I think that's what I'm getting messages about. So please, just given we're a smallish group, do just unmute and speak if you have comments from your own experience or a question, or if you would rather use the chat, go ahead and do that. So the floor is now open for your responses, questions, comments. I'm just looking across. Anybody who wants to come in, or indeed if our panelists want to reflect back from hearing each other speak, or what you've heard Melissa say, do go ahead and unmute. Gustavo, go ahead.
Yes, I really would like to discuss a little bit with the audiences, but we don't have much time. And I completely agree, Melissa, and thank you, Melissa Parker and Grace, for your brilliant presentation. It was very short, but I think that it would be useful how to resist this different experience and how to improve and find new ways to social science to influence the current and diverse scenario all over the world. So especially in the Global South, because as you know, the Global South has different impacts over the pandemic and other repercussions in our regions. One thing that I would like to highlight, usually in the pandemic or epidemic situation, there is a kind of a hierarchical level of one, the political, the governments, and how to respond in the state, and also the technical and scientific. The society usually out from this, how to radicalize the social participation in different levels. So this is something that we really need to think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Su Ming, do speak.
So thanks very much to the speakers, and thank you for chairing this very interesting panel. So I've just been writing a few things with Brazilian collaborators, particularly young doctors working on the front lines and in community and family health, family doctors. And I suppose that I just wanted to respond really to Gustavo's short points by saying that, well, people are really struggling. I think it's really extraordinarily difficult. And we drew on this indigenous, we kind of had this feeling that the kind of like the public realm of information, of knowledge, of the stability, it's kind of very post-normal, post-truth science. So not only post-normal to be constructed with publics, but post-truth, full of disinformation, where the government is periodically giving first misinformation and then disinformation as well. There was a sense that the public realm of SUS, of the public health system, is burning. And this was also accelerated by the physical burning of the Cerrado, the Pantanal, the biomes, the museums, the archives, that it just seemed that everything was on fire. And we just felt that it was so hard to process this question of what we should do, what we should talk about. And we just came across this little piece from Ailton Kreenek's writings on ideas to postpone the end of the world. And we just felt that that was the only thing we could do, was that SUS itself, is the public health system, is an idea that postpones the end of the world, and we shouldn't let that go.
Well, thank you for that, and for that very immediate sense. I just had a message that we'll be closing in 1 minute, so just to wrap up, I want to thank you as an audience. If others have comments, please do put them in the chat. I see we have some more things coming in there, and if anybody wants to engage with us afterwards, please do go ahead and you can email me at IDS, and if you have also experiences to share, because we will be probably building on these reflections going forward, and sort of seeking others who want to share experiences in this way. So thank you so much for joining the session, and thank you to the speakers and the discussant for sharing from your very interesting experiences. Thank you.